to everybody to this insight session, and a fantastic session it's going to be too. We've got some wonderful speakers here today, and I have the privilege of hosting this and encouraging a good grilling of the data and lots of questioning and learning and everything that goes with having experts available to us for a full hour and a half. I was asked to mention that we are recording, and we'll do so for the introductory session, but then for the Q&A, I think you said, Serena, we won't be recording, is that right? Okay, yeah. So it's as our speakers work through. So I will start, obviously, with some introductions. So I'm Richard Vince. I'm the Executive Director for Security, which includes the long-term and high security prisons. And I've been involved with long-term prisoners and offenders and highly complex offenders for the last 2 decades, actually. Most recently, well, not recently, it's now getting on 10 years. I've had the very considerable privilege of leading the long-term high security estate, and now as we morph into Directorate of Security. So hugely keen to hear the debate today, and a huge supporter of all the work and guidance and information and data that Ben and his colleagues have provided for us over any number of years now. So let me introduce firstly Ben, who is the Deputy Director of the Prisons Research Centre and Professor of Penology and Criminal Justice at the Institute of Criminology, University of Cambridge. He's been researching prisons for over 20 years and has published in areas including the social life of prisons, drugs in prisons, and the use of authority. He's joined by Dr Susie Hulley. He's a Senior Research Associate at the Institute of Criminology, University of Cambridge. Her research interests include young people's experiences of the criminal justice system, the process of criminalisation, the legal doctrine of joint enterprise or secondary liability, and the experiences of life imprisonment. And also Dr Serena Wright, who is a lecturer in criminology in the Department of Law and Criminology at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her most recent publications include a paper focused on the experiences of hope and hopelessness among men and women in the late stages of life sentences. Along with Dr Hulley, she has also co-edited a special issue of the Prison Service Journal on life imprisonment, and that's due for publication in the summer. So welcome to you all. I thought by way of starting this session, I would ask you if you could say a little bit about your research, both the original studies and then the follow-up study. So whoever's going first, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you very much for hosting this event. So I'll try and summarise what it is that we've actually done and the background to this study. And I guess the sort of backdrop is a period when Susie and I were working on a separate project and both encountering an increasing number of people who were serving really long sentences of a length that slightly took us by surprise. These were sentences that at the time were as long as both of us had been alive. And I in particular remember meeting someone in prison who was serving an incredibly long sentence, but seemed really sort of resigned to it in a way that I was just quite perplexed by. He seemed sort of not unbothered by it exactly, but rather numbed by it. And this was also a time when I was having conversations with people in the high security directorate at that time who were talking about changes in the nature of the long-term prisoner population. And so we decided to do this piece of research mainly about the experience of serving a very long sentence. So in particular, we were interested in the problems that people encounter when they serve a very long sentence, the way the ways in which they try to build a life for themselves if they're serving many years in custody, and also how they feel about the legitimacy of their situation. In other words, the degree to which it's fair and what impact that has on the way they do their sentence. So what we ended up devising was a study where we deliberately wanted to interview people who had been convicted when they were aged 25 or under, with tariffs of 15 years or more. So what we wanted was a population serving long life sentences who had been convicted when relatively young. We ended up interviewing 125 men and 21 women. I think we went to around 25 establishments overall. We gave out about 300 surveys as well. And we deliberately sampled our interviewees so that we would be able to speak to people who were at different sentence stages. So either within the first 4 years of their sentence, or around the midpoint of their tariff, or within 2 years of their tariff point onwards. That's obviously quite a large group. And I think we've come to realise that there's a world of difference between being a year away from your tariff point in an open prison and being, 10 years over your tariff point and still in high security. But at the time that we sort of saw that as one category. So that's that was the initial study. What we're engaged in at the moment is a follow-up study. So we received funding to re-interview as many people as possible from that original piece of research. So the original research, we conducted the interviews in 2012 and 2013. So it's now almost 10 years on. And we managed to stay in touch with people between the first interviews and now, with the permission of the National Research Committee. And that has really helped. So what we've now done is interviewed around 85 people still in custody, about, I think, probably between 10 and 12 in the community, and we're still going. So that's already, in a way, we're already delighted that we've been able to re-interview so many people. And I guess it's worth just saying what I've already said, really, which is just that some of the people we interviewed the first time around have now been released, so they're on life license in the community. So that's a sort of supplementary element of the study, because we're beginning to put together a picture of what it's like for long-term lifers once they're released. And just finally, I should say that from that original sample, and I know Susie and Serena will correct me if I've got this wrong, I think 3 have died since the first set of interviews, 2 have been deported, at least 1 is now in a secure psychiatric hospital, and we've had 4 people decline to be interviewed the second time round for various reasons. But all of this means that we're really optimistic that we'll end up re-interviewing a really high proportion of the people in the original study. And what that means is we're beginning to get a sense of how people have changed, and also what it is that contextualizes those changes, what makes the difference in terms of people's trajectories through the system and the ways in which they kind of cope in different ways at different points of the sentence.
Thanks, Ben. Susie, anything you would like to add, or anything on your own research?
No, that's fine. I think we that's the sort of background to the research. I did a bit of follow-up research on joint enterprise specifically, but I can talk about that in the questions if anyone's interested. But yeah. Thank you.
And Serena, anything to add? No. Okay, just before we start to ask some questions, we will obviously have a Q&A session, but as we're going through, if there's comments or observations, questions that you would like me to put to our speakers, then do please put them into the chat, and I'll try and pull out themes and specific questions as we go through as well. So, but I mean, I guess I recall some time ago when you had the unenviable task of trying to teach me, you spoke to us about the changes in sentence length, age, demographic, etc., that were for me profound, and something that I hadn't realised when you look back over the time period. I wonder if you could just, to put this discussion in context, just talk about some of those historical changes to long-term prisoner populations, but also perhaps some of the reasons behind it, particularly when we look at some of the legislation that's gone through recently or is going through.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk through that. So there's been really significant changes in the life sentence population in particular in the last 50 years or so. We've seen, we've seen life sentences increase, we've seen the number increase, we've seen the length of sentences increase, and we've also seen in recent times recalls increase. So in 1968 there was 489 people who were serving life. Only 2 had been in custody for a period of more than 15 years. I'm sure there's lots of people on the call who have seen the population change themselves, so that at the end of 2021 there were just over 7,000 people serving life sentences across England and Wales. Around half of them were serving minimum terms of 10 to 20 years, and a further third were given tariffs of at least 20 years. This reflects changes in the average minimum tariff imposed by judges for murder. So we've seen these raise by around 10 years in about a decade. So there were about 12, the average life sentence was around 12 years in 2003, and in 2013 it was 21 years. So, you know, we've seen really huge increases in the length of time that life sentence prisoners are serving and the number of them in the population. And we know that the relationship between the volume of serious crime and the severity of punishment is really complex, but there isn't any clear evidence that we can find that the changes are due to changes in the number of murders, that it doesn't sort of map onto the changes in punishment. So we think that a lot of the changes are to do with sentencing legislation, particularly the 2003 Criminal Justice Act, which brought into effect significant increases in the mandatory minimum terms that judges had to impose for certain types of murder. So, for example, it increased the minimum tariff for murder committed by an adult, where a knife is taken to the scene, from 15 years to 25 years. So overnight we saw the sort of similar types of murder receiving sentences that were a minimum term of 10 years more. We know that the mandatory minimum for murder with a gun or with a firearm for an adult, the starting point is 30 years. So we're already seeing these really high tariffs. And although international comparisons are complex, these are really much higher than in lots of European countries. In terms of the sort of volume of life sentence prisoners, I think it's really difficult to tell because the data is so poor, but it's probably relevant that we're seeing a lot of use of joint enterprise. So, you know, 5 or 6 individuals receiving a murder conviction for one single offence. And like I said, although we can't trace how this has changed over time because there's no data that tells us, you know, when joint enterprise is used in cases, the sort of guesstimates that are produced through Freedom of Information Act suggest that there are really large numbers of the population who are serving murder convictions for joint enterprise. We found in our study, for example, that at least a half of the men that we interviewed were convicted under joint enterprise and about 2/3 of the women. So yeah, there was significant. So obviously these changes in the population have implications for the individuals serving them, for their loved ones, and for the HMPPS, you know, for prison staff who are seeing younger, you know, large cohorts of younger lifers coming into the system, also dealing with people who are growing old in the system, you know, with really long sentences, and for probation staff who are managing people who are coming out into the community who have served sometimes decades in prison.
Thank you. One of the things that I see, Susie, is that the age of people coming in with these sentences, there seem to be far more very young men coming in with very long sentences, and I think also looking at some of their cases, you can feel the change in sentencing practice, because you know, after a long period you get a kind of sense of what that sentence is likely to be, and there's been that inflation. Did your research say anything about the age demographic and what's happening within that life sentence group?
I mean, obviously we only included people who were convicted when they were young, so we haven't included people who are older. It's quite hard to sort of trace the age of the lifers. You know, a lot of the sort of official data that's released doesn't tell you necessarily, doesn't break down the cohort into a lot of detail in terms of how old people are. But I think it's certainly true that we see a lot of young people and coming in for particularly long sentences, because like I said, because the mandatory minimums have increased. You know, a young person who would have previously received a starting point of 15 years, so that might have come down, there might have been mitigating circumstances around their age, and now serving a minimum of 25. And because of joint enterprise, what we know about joint enterprise as well is that it disproportionately impacts on young black and mixed race boys and men. So, you know, a high proportion of people who are serving these long sentences when they're young are also disproportionately from black and mixed race communities. So yeah, the data is quite hard to kind of to get hold of and work through in the analysis, but there is data that shows that there is a growing number of young men in particular coming in for really long sentences.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions here. So from Amanda Anderson, have life sentences for offences other than murder increased, i.e. robbery, etc.?
I'm going to speak on behalf of all of us and say I'm not sure that we know, just because that isn't what we've looked at. Yeah, I simply don't know, to be honest.
And the second question was from Joe King. Have the studies included any prisoners on whole life orders?
No, and I'm trying to remember. I think we deliberately excluded people on whole life orders because it felt to us as though it's just a really different thing having a sentence where you know you will never be released. We've always been interested in issues like sort of the indeterminacy of the sentence and how that impacts on people, and also how it is that people serving really long sentences prepare for release, think about their future. So no, this isn't a study that includes people on with whole life tariffs.
Okay. Sorry, Richard, can I just add that I meant to say when we were talking about the population changes that there has been such a huge increase in people serving whole life orders. So there was 23 in 2000 and there's around 63 now. So it is a really important cohort, but not part of our study.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I recall reading that sentences that are now being received back in the 70s and 80s would have been regarded as unsurvivable, I think was the phrase. And I was very taken reading your original research about the way that you described the different stages that people go through as they move through that sentence. And I wonder if you could please just talk a bit about those findings, and also whether what you found in the original study and what you found in the follow-up, whether that holds true.
Yeah, I can take that. I guess, as Ben mentioned, like for the initial study, we were interested. I think sometimes there's a misperception that our study has focused only on young people. I guess the interest was on people who were sentenced when young, but who then went through these different points of these different stages. So we interviewed people who ranged in age from 18 to their mid-60s, who had served kind of 10 months of a 25-year tariff to someone who had served, you know, upwards of 40 years. And to try and kind of make sense of the size of the cohort and look at these different experiences, as you said, Richard, we wanted to look at the different stages. So the people who were in, say, the early stage of their sentence, and we conceptualize that as having served less than 5 years of their tariff. we then wanted to think about people who were sort of getting halfway through and how that felt. So we conceptualized the mid stage, which was halfway through the tariff, give or take 2 years, and then people who were at the late stage, so within 2 years of tariff or post tariff, I guess, because they seemed to us initially to be just quite different parts of the experience. There's different expectations, different hopes, ambitions, different fears. And so when we then went and did the study, I guess what we found was that the narratives that were produced in those people in those kind of broad stages were quite markedly different. So, you know, when you talk about the sentence being unsurvivable, these particularly long sentences, certainly that was the sense I think we got very much in the early stage. So individuals who were, and because they were all convicted under 25, young men and women who have barely reached the threshold of, like, you know, what we now understand to be full maturation, trying to come to terms with the fact that the life, whatever life they thought they might have, is now gone, that they are facing an inconceivably long period of time in prison. And obviously all of us, obviously, but they all had life sentences. These were all mandatory life sentences. Everyone had been convicted of murder. And so there's something really important as well in that early, we talked about entry shock in our work, about the entry shock of the early stage. You're not just struggling to come to terms with what it means to be in prison, because over half of them had never even been to prison before, let alone for something like murder. They were emotionally flooded. We've talked about emotional flooding, being overwhelmed with anger, with a sense of non-legitimacy, and I'm sure Susie might add later something about the role of joint enterprise in that, about absolute despair, about the loss of family connections and kind of ties to loved ones, the loss of potential futures. There was a lot, we heard a lot about just surviving in that stage. You couldn't really talk about people coping at that point. It was just getting through day to day. So there was a lot of talk of sleeping, but substance use, a lack of engaging with the system, fighting, being involved in the prison economy. And I guess people talked a lot about kind of what we conceived of, not as kind of psychologically defending against, like, what could they do to keep this all at bay, particularly the pains that were brought in through, say, intrusive memories or flashbacks around the offence in particular. I guess what we found then, as we interviewed, not that we did it in a linear fashion, but when we interviewed people who were at the mid stage, that there was a sense that there was a shift somehow from surviving to kind of a more of a coping situation. We've described it as kind of shifting from drowning to kind of, you know, swimming with the tide rather than trying to push back or fight against it or being submerged by it. People were starting to come to terms with, or had come to terms with, the sentence that they would be serving. And even if they hadn't come to terms with the offence, because I guess a lot of them say to us, you know, even after 40 years, you never come to terms with having committed a murder. You're still absolutely overwhelmed every day with shame and remorse for that. And I guess that people were starting to, either through religion or through work on the self, sometimes through therapy or offending behaviour courses, start to try and process some of what had happened, why they'd done what they'd done, what the implications of it were, and really shifted away from the early stage. Was very inward focused, thinking about the self and their immediate family, starting to think then in the mid stage about the victim, about the victim's family, and about the wider implications of what had happened. And I think that there was also then some sort of hope about the future, that people talked about, you know, engaging. People would start to, at the start there wasn't an end to the tunnel, let alone a light there, but I think in the mid stage people started to see that a bit more and have these kind of fantasies about what life might be like. And then I guess as people kind of came to the end of you know, their sentence, the late stage that we looked at, that hope seemed to be challenged quite a lot. People really struggled that, you know, people had spent so long telling us in the early stage, in the mid stage, once I get to Cat D, that's it, I'm out. Once I get to open, I'll be out in the community. Like, that feels like a really significant thing. And then you start talking to people who are in open conditions, and it's like, you know, this is so much harder than being in closed conditions. The threats are so real. The implications of getting it wrong are catastrophic. Everything felt so unpredictable and so, you know, on eggshells. I think that there were a lot of different struggles that people didn't anticipate in the late stage, and having to confront the fact that the fantasies you had at the mid stage about what life might be like were not likely to happen. That's a really difficult thing to come to terms with. So those were the original stages, and just, I guess, one thing that we found since we've been doing this new study, I think, is getting a sense of fleshing out what's been happening in between those stages and in real time. And I think one thing that, you know, I can speak on behalf of the team that we found really difficult, and I'm sure that many of you in the system will be confronting on a daily basis when you work with this population, is what it's like to be stuck between what we might think of as the early and the mid stage. If you're doing something like 25, 30, 35 years, some of the experiences, some of the interviews that have been the darkest and kind of the most filled with despair are the people that are stuck between those stages, where they've got, you know, they've got nothing to do. There's nothing, the system's not, you know, designed to cater for them. It never was envisaged to be dealing with people for this kind of length of time. There's not a lot that they feel that they have to live for, not a lot of hope there, I think. So yeah, I think that that's you know, the sense of people being in limbo is a consequence of these increasingly long sentences that we're really seeing played out in real time now.
Great, thank you. Can I just start? What impact does the nature of the offence have on how people experience that sentence?
Would one of you two like to take it?
Yeah, I can, that's fine. So I think Serena sort of touched on this when she was talking about the early stage, that we found generally that it became clear to us that you can't understand the way people experience their life sentence for murder without taking account of the offence of murder itself. And that in the early stage in particular, that sort of emotional tsunami that Serena was talking about was a reaction to often to being involved in a murder or seeing a murder. Obviously, if you're a secondary party, if you sort of were around a murder. And looking back on this time, men and women often describe these kind of signs of what's acute stress disorder. So things like Serena mentioned, intrusive thoughts and flashbacks, distressing dreams, disassociation, where they kind of felt dazed and like they were in a sort of dreamlike state, and severe depression. And that's certainly also been what's happened as we talk to people at the second study, that yeah, when they reflect back on that stage, they see that as kind of when they were deepest in the system often, or, you know, with really severe feelings of depression. And yeah, these sort of things could also be relevant to those who have sort of witnessed a murder if they were in a group of people. And as time went on, almost all of our participants recognised the kind of moral enormity of the offence, so of what they'd done or what they'd been involved in. For those who considered themselves guilty of the offence, most didn't dispute that they deserved a significant punishment. They might believe that the actual length of time they were serving was excessive, but they recognised that they needed some form of punishment. And even those convicted under joint enterprise often felt that they were guilty of something, so something like perverting the course of justice or violent disorder, but something that didn't necessarily attract a life sentence. And so in the second study, in the follow-up study now, we're just starting to explore the different ways or the way in which different types of murder may carry what we're thinking about as a kind of different moral weight. So we're hearing people talk, we think, in quite distinctive ways about the offence themselves. Now, these are really early sort of thoughts that we're going to explore, and it might, our findings and our analysis might change a little from this, but it appears that people who have committed what a colleague of ours, Ben Jarman, calls kind of incomprehensible murders, that those that they kind of can't even make sense of, that seem really heinous and kind of, you know, incomprehensible, that they carry the most moral weight, and that this is expressed in terms of guilt and shame and sort of distress. So trying to kind of make sense of why you've done something is a really heavy load to carry. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there seems to be a group of individuals for whom the moral weight of the offence is a bit less cumbersome. So they seem to have been involved in murders involving kind of drug disputes or the sort of street-based disputes that we hear about. And in these cases, individuals seem to feel like the victim wasn't entirely innocent, or that the situation could have resulted in themselves being killed. So it's kind of, it was either him or me. And so it happened that the other person was the ultimate victim, but it could have been me. And you know, and we all knew what was kind of coming. We all knew what we were involved in. And so these men, and I think it's safe to say it's all the men, you know, all the people that I'm thinking of, it's amongst the male participants. They seem to sort of carry a lighter responsibility, lighter moral responsibility, in terms of the death of another person. They feel sadness and they recognise the broader implications about the murder. So they recognise that it's sad for the family of the victim. You know, they recognise that it's had really serious implications for their own family, but they don't seem as wrecked by the offence by those who have committed more sort of normatively heinous crimes. And we think we're finding that the moral messages don't seem to be coming from necessarily from the prison or from kind of offending behaviour courses as such. I mean, Sycamore Tree gets mentioned quite a lot in terms of kind of recognising victims and kind of coming to terms with the kind of ripple effect of their offence. But actually, it's a more personal process of sense making, so around the offence they've committed. And actually, I think we're, you know, ourselves thinking about some of the ways in which sort of normatively and in the public, there's a bit of a difference in the sort of moral weight associated with certain types of offences. You know, murder is of course seen as a really serious, heinous crime, but the circumstances in which those murders happen can be kind of narrated quite differently depending on the way in which they're happened. So as I said, it's kind of early exploratory findings, but there's something really interesting. The offence itself is definitely a very significant part of the experience of people convicted of murder, but it might be there might be slightly different reactions and sort of thought process going on depending on the circumstances of the murder. Ben, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about the daily presence of the victim and, you know, kind of how much we hear about the victim.
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly about that, because I think it's just really important to stress how much shame and remorse people express to us. Sometimes people in the early stage of the sentence talked about that, but certainly people that were a few years in were often really preoccupied with their own feelings of shame and remorse and wanting to make amends for what they had done, sort of wanting to demonstrate within prison that they were ethical people despite what it was that they had done. So obviously our study is not about victims of murder, but it felt as though victims were kind of everywhere but nowhere at the same time, if you see what I mean, with a kind of absent presence. So really what I mean by that is that people thought a lot about their victims or their victims' families, and they were not. I think there's no one in our sample, more or less, who or only a very small number of people who express anything like kind of indifference to the victim. Much more often, people are really struggling to come to terms with what it is that they have done, and even people who have been convicted under joint enterprise and who feel that either the conviction or the sentence length is illegitimate or excessive, they still often talk with quite a lot of remorse about whatever secondary involvement they might have had. So these feelings of sort of this kind of moral reflection and these feelings of remorse feature really powerfully, and the victims are a kind of constant presence, I think, in the minds of most of our interviewees, and some people talk really powerfully about kind of hating themselves and feeling like they are unforgivable people given what it is they have done. That's not uniform, that doesn't go for everyone, but we're hearing that quite a lot, and it's there's a couple of people that have asked questions about what can we do to help people serving such long sentences. Well, one thing I think is to be paying as much attention as possible to what it is that people are going through in terms of their feelings about the sort of moral significance of what they've done, and the importance of finding ways to help people process what it is they've done, and why they came to a point where where whatever act they were involved in became possible for them.
Yeah, there's an interesting question here from Victoria Gray as well. I'm sure you can see that in the chat, Ben. Did you just pick up the issue there about support for those on life or IP sentences approaching release? And there's also an earlier question from Amanda about whether the research included any differences between those on life sentences and those serving IPPs. I wonder if you just pick those 2 points up.
I feel like we're constantly disappointing you, Amanda, because we didn't include IPP sentences either, so we can't answer that. In terms of the question about supporting people as they approach their release date and post-release, I don't know whether you want to address that, Serena.
Yeah, I sure can. I guess so. We've most recently written about that in terms of hope, and also, hi Vicky, it's nice that you're on the call. Yeah, I think that one of the problems that we've seen in terms of hopelessness at the late stage was very much around the parole process, the probation process, the fears about kind of being out on release, and then some of the few interviews that we've done in the community. I think it's been really difficult. It's been really difficult. Some of the regulations have changed, is our understanding about how long now people are supervised on life license when they come out. People have been very upset and angry about that. And I think that the probation service, from what we've heard and what we've seen and what we know, is completely overstretched and overwhelmed. And I think yeah, it's been incredibly difficult for you guys, particularly during COVID. I think that there was some of the people that were in the late stage who were going through the parole process really struggled with, I think, a lack of communication and a lack of consistent communication. I don't know if it's too far to say perhaps a lack of perceived empathy in terms of, you know, we had individuals tell us that they felt that their time, you know, didn't matter as much if they had to wait 3 weeks for something. It was like, well, you've done 20 years, what does 3 weeks matter? And they're kind of saying, well, I've been looking at release for the last 20 years. 3 weeks is closer to me repairing the relationship with my children, to getting a job, to starting my life. So I think having some sort of sense of that. I think that there might be something that can be done, although we don't know what, around promoting honest dialogue. What we've heard so much is the ways in which, as you're approaching release, particularly as you're in Cat D and after release, the challenges that you face, the depression you experience, the relapses you might have, you stop talking about those things. Or if you ever did, there was lots of discussion about how those things were held in tight and withdrawn from official notice, because even though they knew they should talk about them, that there was such fear that that was going to be read as a risk and have them sent back to closed conditions, or if they, or being recalled from outside, that it smothered honesty, and it smothered the opportunity for meaningful intervention at a point at which it might still be useful, and possibly to stop those things from kind of happening. Some of the problems that we've seen on the outside, I don't know how much probation they can do with them. It seems like a bigger issue. For example, we've seen people talk a lot about what we've conceptualized as kind of voluntary reclusiveness, where actually the probation officer seems to be the only point of contact, really, apart from maybe a partner, that people have in the outside world. They're afraid to maintain contacts from the inside in case that gets them recalled. They're terrified to make new friends because they don't want to have to disclose that they've been in for murder since they were 18 or 20 or so on. For the women in particular who have had children since then, just some really kind of sad stories about the lack of support they've got around childcare. They don't make friends at their prenatal classes. They don't make friends at the nursery gates because they just can't bear to tell anyone that, how can they go on a play date with the child of a convicted murderer, is very much their sense. So I think there's a lot of profound loneliness, self-imposed isolation, stigma, that I just don't think the entire system and society is really equipped for at the moment, which is a bleak picture, which I'll now hand over to Ben and Susie and see if they can say something more uplifting.
Not much that's uplifting. I just wanted to add, and I know that this may not be helpful, but because, as Serena says, we're very aware of the pressure on probation practitioners. But at the moment, the interviews we've done in the last few months with people, we asked them about their relationship with their offender manager, for example. And the thing they most often say is, my offender manager changes every 6 months. Or I just don't ever really get to see my offender manager. So I think that kind of, that clearly won't help, that people feel they have to constantly rebuild that relationship. And of course, rebuilding that relationship also means starting again in terms of having support from someone who really knows who you are, the circumstances of your case, the particular, family circumstances that you might have. So that we're hearing that all the time.
Thank you. Just picking up on that theme about women both in custody and on release. What were the main differences that your research highlighted in the experiences of men and women?
I guess that when we did the original study and we looked at the survey, I think as Ben mentioned, that we did the survey as well, and we conceptualized kind of a series of problem statements, things like I feel like my life is being wasted in here, I spend a lot of time thinking about the crime I committed and so on. And we conceptualized them or gathered them together into like a series of dimensions. So these were around things like the deprivations people had experienced, mental health, control and autonomy. And what we found was that every single one of those dimensions, quantitatively, women were reporting greater levels of severity that they were experiencing those problems with across the cohort. It's worth saying that obviously the number of women that we interviewed and that we surveyed is quantitatively much smaller than the men, but I think that's why women get left out so often, right? That's because they're such a smaller population and comparatively. But it showed some really important things, and I think that when we then did the interviews, that there was some of that we were able to make sense of. I think in terms of the stuff around control and autonomy, the lack of trust, the lack of privacy was almost inevitably grounded in the overwhelming experiences of pre-prison trauma and abuse that women had experienced. And, we've heard a lot of stories of abuse from the men, of victimization, of lives of violence, of, lack of trust, certainly. But there's something tangibly different, we think, about the way that male authority figures in these women's lives repeatedly and often sexually abuse them, and the impact that that's had on trust of being in confined spaces with male prison officers, of how that feels when you have your period and you need to access sanitary products, and that the control over whether you have that or not is being held over you by a male prison officer. There are just so there are those kind of things in terms of like the control and autonomy. And then I guess there are the relational dimensions. So often when the men, particularly in the early stage, they talked about what they were struggling with in terms of relational deprivations, they would talk about their relationship with their parents, because they were so young. Most were still living with their parents, and even those who weren't were worried about letting down their parents or upsetting usually their mum. And although they usually had quite a low baseline, those male parental relationships usually reported improvement. Whereas for the women, there was such a host of complex issues. Some of the women were disowned and abandoned by their family. They talked about being left to rot because of what they've done. Some of the women themselves engaged in therapy in prison and stepped away themselves from their families because of the abuse they'd experienced younger. But I guess one of the most overwhelming kind of features was that women were far more likely than the men to have been primary carers of children. And so actually the sense of being removed, in many cases permanently, from that relationship, if your child was put into foster care or into state care, and even left with say an ex-partner's parents, the difficulties in access, the degradation of those relationships. One of the women said to us, nobody ever told me that I'd have to learn how not to be a mum while I was on this sentence. the women are also battling with, you know, those who haven't had children are battling with the implications of, if you come in your mid or early 20s and you get a 20-year sentence, does this also represent the death of my biological possibilities to have my own children? And that's something, you know, and the women often have to watch their siblings go through having children, and they're expected to be happy for them without any real support being provided or understanding of how gut-wrenching and devastating that is for them as well, I think. Susie, do you want to add anything on the women?
Yeah, I think I was just going to say something about joint enterprise. I feel like that's all I ever do, but just to say that I think I mentioned at the start that that about 2/3 of the women were convicted under joint enterprise. I mean, lots of them didn't understand that, so I think they self-reported as about half, but there was more when we looked into the cases. And what we know from research by Clark and Chadwick on women implicated in sort of these types of offences is that the women have very rarely perpetrated any violence in the incidents. So quite often the conviction can feel really, really illegitimate, that you are serving a murder conviction for being in a sort of at a scene in which other people were perpetrating violence. That's also true for some of the men, but it's particularly true for the women. And what I found during sort of a deeper exploration of this data is that around half of those women were convicted alongside a partner or ex-partner, and that when you sort of look into the details of their lives, that these partners and ex-partners had very often been the perpetrators of domestic violence or coercive control. And so for women to try and kind of make sense of for themselves, but also then narrate in offending behaviour courses, for example, which are very sort of individualised, risk focused, how the women come to make sense of what they could or should have done in these circumstances, what they ought to take responsibility for, in a context in which, you know, there was high levels of fear and distress among people for whom they had experienced a lot of violence or coercive control at the hands of, that had really sort of significant implications on the women as they went through their sentence. So, you know, how can they make sense of what they should have done? How do they make sense of, you know, the power that they did or didn't have in those circumstances to make a difference? How do they narrate being convicted, you know, taking responsibility for the murder which they're convicted of, whilst also feeling that they might not necessarily have had a great deal of power in those situations? So I think it is a really I think it is a really significant part of our findings, that just in terms of how many women weren't the principal perpetrator of the offence.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a reference that Serena made to mental health, because I think for all the practitioners on this line, the issue of mental health and mental well-being is going to be a constant. I just wonder if you could expand on research findings around the issue of mental health, and potentially also around sort of personality disorder, ASD type disorders as well, and what your study was finding in that area.
Yeah, I mean, mental health issues are really prominent in the study. Very high numbers of people over the first and second study have described to us feelings of depression and anxiety. I think, as we've already said, feelings of sort of guilt and shame and sadness were felt really strongly at the start of the sentence, when the enormity of the predicament sort of overwhelmed people. For some people, feelings were got too much and they made attempts on their lives. There was quite a few people who talked to us about thinking that they couldn't bear the sentence initially and just thought that it would have been better to take their own lives. There were sort of key points of vulnerability as well. For example, when the sentence hit or the offence kind of hit, and that wasn't always immediate. In fact, it was often coming to terms with the offence, was, like Serena said, often didn't ever happen, but also kind of when the sentence hit, that might be 3, 4, 5, 6 years down into the sentence. So you know, there were these key moments of vulnerability when a family member died, for example, that could really sort of throw people off into experiencing really severe mental health problems. Key anniversaries around the offence, for example, and the sort of effective intensity of the life sentence also re-emerged near release. So I think, as Serena has talked about, the kind of anxiety and fear of life on release could also make people feel, you know, these sort of heightened senses of anxiety. But also that depression was kind of, it just felt like it was everywhere, and it has felt like it's been everywhere in the second study as well, that there's these sort of cycles of depression and also kind of general low level of depression. Like even people who were doing quite well didn't always seem like they were sort of flourishing or anything. They tended to be kind of floundering but sort of getting through. But also that so many of these mental health problems appeared to be undiagnosed. I mean, there was plenty of people that talked to us about being on medication, but plenty of people who sort of said, well, yeah, I often feel low, or I go through these really low periods where I sleep all the time, but, you know, I've never sort of gone to the doctor, or lots of concerns around going and reporting mental health problems and sort of how that may appear on a report later, or, you know, with more severe mental health issues, you know, kind of intrusive thoughts or hallucinations, real key concerns around what that might be and how that might be perceived for the sentence. Yeah, it was pretty striking that there wasn't a lot of kind of positive, effective emotions, people not talking too much about, you know, the kind of the other side of the coin. I think we've also, I mean, it's interesting that I think we're starting to, in the second study, I think I've been more aware of diagnoses of autism and ADHD, which I think is very prevalent in the prison population anyway. Yeah, problems with PTSD rooted in traumatic experiences from before prison, but also obviously related to the offence itself. I think, as Ben mentioned, we know that one person has been transferred to secure psychiatric estate. There's somebody else who's said that they are being referred currently. We know when we started the study that we were told that there were around 190 prisoners who had been transferred to the secure psychiatric estate from, you know, who fitted our criteria, which was around a fifth of the population, which we found really surprising. And it meant that, you know, the study has never got to the sort of people who were the most distressed or who were experiencing the most significant mental health problems. I think what we're finding now in the second study is that we think that we're seeing more distress. Obviously, it would be possible for people to say that's about COVID and things like that. But I also think that, you know, if we asked people to take part in the study the first time and they were experiencing really severe distress or they were experiencing quite severe mental health problems, chances are they would have said they didn't want to take part. Whereas I think now that we have a relationship with people, they're more likely to say they'll take part. They understand what the interviews are around and they understand the way that, you know, whether they can sort of cope with them. And so I think in the interviews themselves, we are seeing more sort of mental health problems, more distress. But it's definitely been really prevalent, especially the sort of depression and anxiety, but with these other sort of quite serious mental health problems emerging as well.
Yeah,
sorry, Ben, yeah, go on.
Sorry, Richard. I was just going to add one thing to what Susie said, which is that certainly what I've noticed with my interviews is that quite a lot of the men are saying things that are inconsistent. You have to really listen quite carefully. So that they're saying, I'm really strong and I can cope, and the sentence has made me even stronger. And then a few minutes later, they're saying, I have these moments, I have these periods of terrible depression. So actually, there's a kind of, on the surface, there are a set of people who seem to be coping well, and the way they talk about themselves is that they're very strong and resilient. But clearly, there's something more going on too, which is kind of people being in a real kind of existential pit. So part of the reason I say that is that my guess is that to lots of prison staff, the sorts of people in our sample don't want to present as having problems, and certainly among their peer groups they don't want to come across as vulnerable. But there's quite a lot of vulnerability there, even among the prisoners who present themselves as being kind of pretty sort of tough.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to sort of recall a conversation I had with probation colleagues the week before last, where they were explaining to me that quite a number of people are coming into the community, and that's where the diagnosis is being given of ASD, etc., which is interesting. And I just wonder if you kind of had a view on the level of support and I guess awareness of the range of mental health issues that we've discussed within prisons and probation, and do you get a sense that that's playing into our kind of measures to help people and to assess risk, etc.?
I don't know who wants to answer that.
That's quite.
I think we'd all give quite a similar answer. Is it going to be the old "I'm not quite sure"? I'm afraid.
I think it probably is. I mean, this is a way of slightly swerving the question, but what people do talk very positively about is sort of serious therapeutic intervention. So, I mean, we interviewed some people in Grendon, so obviously that sort of skews our sample, but Grendon is, one of the Cat B training prisons. Dovegate has a therapeutic community, and people that had gone through TCs or in Gartrey as well, they talked really positively about the impact of those sorts of interventions. And I think that is partly because, well, obviously, some of that is to do with people wanting to understand what it is they had done. Some of that was people dealing with much deeper issues that were linked to their offending, but also more broadly linked to their just sort of elements of themselves and their lives that they had never really fully understood. So I think, it's certainly those sorts of long-term, deep therapeutic programs that are talked about most positively in terms of support. I guess not necessarily for the sorts of things you're talking about, Richard, but sort of general support in terms of psychological well-being. Just very consistently positive about therapeutic communities. I mean,
it'd be good to expand on that a little bit, actually, because we've got a really great question here from Corinne, who's asking about what helps people move forward. And I wonder if you could just outline what your study told you about the value that people placed on offender behaviour courses and other kinds of interventions. And what other sources of change do they discuss? So my own experience is there comes a point, normally around a sort of age bracket that what we call the hook that finally gets somebody engaged and moving forward. But what are the hooks? What are the things? What works?
Okay. So with regard to cognitive behavioural programs, the picture is quite complicated. So lots of academics are a bit sniffy and dismissive about programs, but and it was quite rare that people said to us that cognitive behavioural programs had been transformational for them. But people did often say, well, doing courses has helped me understand myself a bit better, or it's given me certain skills that help me improve my decision making and so on. And often the courses were effective, I think, in tandem with other sorts of things. So people sometimes say, well, the courses have helped reaffirm to me that the changes that I feel I'm undergoing are real. In other words, people saying, I'm pretty sure that I'm maturing, and doing the course has helped me realize that I am, and so on. But it's not courses, apart from things like victim awareness courses, psychomotory and so on, which people talk about very positively. It's not normally cognitive behavioural programs that people are talking about when they're discussing what it is that has helped them change and process in a positive way what it is they've done and the sentence. The three things that seem to matter most, or the three the three forms that are helping people most in their sentence are faith, education and therapy. So I think this is I mean, partly these are all things that help you feel that you're using your time productively, but that's a really superficial sort of way of thinking about what they contribute. I think the more significant thing is that all three of them, faith, education, therapy, they give people a way of understanding themselves and their place in the world. And also, to use your language, Richard, they're kind of hooks for change. So all of them provide people with a kind of a narrative and a set of tools for becoming a different kind of person. I think faith is really interesting and complicated, but you know, there are lots of, when people talk about the importance of faith, some of it is about, sometimes it's about finding goodness in the everyday. In other words, if you're, you know, think about it, you're serving a 20 or 25-year sentence, you need something that gets you through each day and that helps you see the positive. Some of it, and this is less upbeat, is people saying, well, my life is, you know, I have to believe that there's an afterlife that could be positive for me because my life at the moment is so terrible. But I think faith and education in particular, I talked earlier about people in our study wanting to demonstrate themselves to be good people. And I think faith and education provide all sorts of minor ways in which people can demonstrate that to themselves and to others. They both give a sense of progression, both provide a kind of ethical framework that people can use as a way, not just to navigate the everyday world of the prison, but to think about their futures and their identities. So a lot of this is about the sort of existential reflection that people are engaging in when they're a few years into their sentence and just need something that will sustain them and that will kind of lift them out of the sort of mundane everyday world of the prison.
Can I add something?
Yeah,
just I think that something else that we've seen, or certainly picked up on in the follow-up study, that sometimes those things can't be planned and they can't be provided for and they can't be included in courses. So I think there are some people, more than a few, who have said to us, actually, it was only when I lost someone important, a parent, a grandparent, that I actually realised what I'd done. And I think that that's something particular to this cohort, right? That although some of them, particularly those who had been caught up in what might be, I guess, described as kind of gang-based worlds, that they had seen death, they'd seen serious violence, they'd perhaps escaped death themselves, they had lost people. But I think for some of the other people who hadn't seen that, it was only when they lost, you know, I can think of two guys right at the start of the study who talked about losing their grandfather, who said, I suddenly thought, oh my God, what have I done? And this is even worse because he was an old man who died, and it was terribly sad, and I'm crushed by it. But I took that person from their family. So I think it would be the wrong language to say to build or to capitalize on those moments, but I guess it's having an awareness that things like that, while incredibly difficult for people who came in young convicted of murder, that they can also it's not standard, not everyone will feel that way, but there's the possibility that might offer a hook for change, and it's about how that's managed as well. I think that determines whether it can be adopted as a positive turning point, or whether it is, as Susie mentioned earlier, something that feeds back into a cycle of depression and trauma.
Thank you. I'm going to start trying to move us towards a Q&A session very soon, but there was just a couple of other points I just wanted to pick up on if I could. You talked there, Ben and Serena, actually about people's view to the future, and we within the long-term high security prisons talk a lot about hope, and we've seen lots of research that tells us about the positive impacts of creating hope. I just wondered what your research has shown about the role that hope is playing in people managing their sentences. But I guess for us, what can we do as a service to offer and nurture a sense of hope at the different stages of these sentences?
Sorry for my doorbell. anyone else that can hear the William Tell overture. I think that definitely, as I mentioned earlier, hope at the early stage was really difficult to foster. People couldn't see a way out. The special issue that we're doing in the Prison Service Journal, there's a paper, an excellent paper by Sadie and Thomas, that talks about their experience of running an intervention for young men aged 15 to 17 at Cook and Wood, that was a therapy group, mentalization based therapy group, in which they had young men come together and talk about what it was like to be at that age, to be convicted of murder, perhaps to have committed a murder, to be sentenced to such a long time, to be in the prison environment for this period of time. And while I wouldn't necessarily say, you know, that, and I would encourage you guys to read it when it comes out, that engendered hope necessarily, it certainly fostered a sense of what they reported was that when they followed these young men up as they'd moved on, transition to the adult estate, that they were perhaps doing better than their peers in terms of adjusting, in terms of being able to talk about these things and think about these things. I guess when I talked earlier about hope at the mid stage, although some of the stuff would be, you know, that people had hope about would be considered probably quite fantastical in a way, it's really important in a sense that there's definitely a balance to be struck, I think, between not getting people lost in that, so that the expectations become all they have to live for and that they're crushed when it's not there, but also that those things are necessary, that you have to have something to hope for when you're in a dark place, because that's what allows you to kind of keep getting up in the morning to move forward. And I think the stuff that we've written there's lots of ways of conceptualizing hope, but I think that one of the ways we've written about it most recently is using Snyder's kind of framework, and that talks about hope as being something that is bound up in having a goal or a purpose, having a pathway to that goal, and having a sense that you've got the agency or the capacity to reach it. So when we think about hope around release and about a future life, where we saw most hopelessness was where people either, you know, no longer felt that their goal was what they thought it was. So for those who, you know, we had people who were in their 50s and 60s who thought they were getting out in their late 30s, early 40s, and they're like, what's out there for me now? You know, I don't understand how to live in this world. This is not my world. There's nothing out there. One said, except grief and shit. That's all that's out there for me now. And they retreat from that. We found that people who repeatedly felt their pathways were blocked, or that they didn't understand the process, that their agency had been taken away, were also very deeply mired in hopelessness. And I think one of the things that we argued in our hope paper was that actually that it doesn't seem to be irreversible, that there are things that that institutions can do that do revolve around communication, which is key, working with people to talk about kind of pathways to the sort of release that they are likely to have, and being compassionate about, I guess, what that's likely to look like, and that it might not mirror up with their mid-stage hopes and dreams. I think ways in which small forms of agency or kind of, you know, proactivity can be encouraged, and people can take an active role in planning their release and making that. And there's something I think that we're hearing very much about, and a lot of it is around COVID, about the programs that have been shut down, about vocational opportunities, about what's available and what's not now. And hopefully things will start to resume a bit of balance around those, because those opportunities seem really important. I think once it comes to outside, one of the things that people seemed most crushed by, certainly in the interviews I've done, was being told, don't even bother, just get on benefits and get yourself a council place. And I think that, you know, you can definitely see that from, I imagine from probation's point of view, that I can see that that's a value, right? You're ensuring somebody's got shelter, they've got consistent money, and they've got a roof over their head. But I think that what that does to an individual's self-esteem, to their dignity and their sense of worth, and the fact that they want a sense of pride, they want to make a difference, that sometimes that those things then don't necessarily marry up. So again, maybe it's about communication.
The other thing that's probably worth saying, even though it may feel very obvious, is that the primary source of hope for people is family. So even in our sample with people serving years, years and years away from their families, we can't sort of overstate the importance of family ties. So Susie might want to say something about kind of some of our thoughts about visits and so on in relation to this, but certainly, those connections that people have to the world outside still really matter. And my sense, again, we're sort of early on in the analysis of these new interviews, is that it's a lot of people have managed to maintain their family connections, but some of the people we've interviewed out in the community, especially a handful that were convicted of serious sexual offences, I think there is a connection between the fact that they've often lost almost all of their family ties and this really profound sense of loneliness and isolation that they describe. Did you want to say, Susie, something about visits and family ties?
Yeah. So yeah, just to make the point that, as Ben said, family ties, when families are good, when the relationship is positive, that family ties are so important, and that it can be really difficult. I mean, this isn't rocket science, but it can be really difficult to maintain meaningful relationships over such long periods. And particularly, if you come in young and you're changing all the time, finding ways to change together, I guess, or to kind of understand each other when you're not living with one another as a family can be difficult. And that, there are only so many ways that you can sort of engage with each other, phones or letters or visits. And that I feel like I heard it a lot more in the first study, actually, and maybe that's just because we haven't really analysed the family details in the second study, but that that visits can be really difficult, and that they can be really awkward, and trying to think of something to say to your family over 20 years when your life is pretty limited in terms of what's going on for you day to day, kind of, and particularly because there are these complicated issues with communication which are about protecting one another. So you tell each other most stuff, and people said that they were often emotionally closer, but they were still withholding information, and they knew families were doing the same because they're trying to protect one another from being upset or hurt that somebody's more ill than you thought, or that you've just seen a fight on the wing, or that that you've been put at risk in some way. So I think while visits are, I think, kind of seen as the gold star of family relationships, and certainly family visits are really, really highly regarded, the kind of the longer visits where you can kind of do more things together. But there's some work by Anna Kotova who talks about the kind of the quality of the relation, the quality of the interaction, and how I'm sure that how there are there's points of good practice which are about sharing experiences and making memories together, and having things to talk about. So the examples of visits where people get to cook together, or I think we had one there, they get to dance together, or the things where you're creating new memories together, because over 20 years you might not do that if there aren't any opportunities, and and visits themselves, sitting in front of somebody, can end up being quite awkward and difficult to know how to communicate after years. So I think thinking of kind of creative ways to ensure that people can have these kind of quality, what we think of as family time together, the ways in which some of our own memories with our families can be rooted in really sort of mundane everyday experiences of eating together, or that suddenly somebody says something hilarious and everybody starts laughing, and those are the memories that people have, that it's it's obviously really difficult to replicate within the system, but just thinking of ways that people can be creative about those interactions that are building memories, and that are kind of encouraging people to think about other things to talk about than what's happened on the wing, or where they're at in their sentence, for example.
Thank you. Right, look, I'm going to stop there.